Hi everyone, I'm recording this on Sunday, so this is going to be the recording for section 10. So it's not a hugely important, it's not crucial section of the course. So what I'm suggesting is that this one to lighten the load a little bit, we're going to do a more sort of instructor-led section. So you've already got the PowerPoint on Moodle. I'm going to load up the video now. So what I suggest is during Sunday and Monday, maybe watch the video. On Monday night, we're going to have a collaborate session where we're going to open up and make it interactive. Revisit pretty much what we've got on this PowerPoint, but engage in more discussions and maybe clarify certain points. And then that will be it. And then you'll be free to return to some of the readings later on if you're interested in exploring the global dimension of higher and higher education teaching and learning at a later stage. But it's not crucial in the assessment part. So that's why we can maybe reduce your load there a little bit. The forums, I'm not going to ask you to engage in the forums in a discussion thread. What I suggest is for today, Sunday and Monday, maybe you can use the forum if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to share certain experiences about this global dimension of higher education teaching and learning. So what are the objectives today? We're going to look at some of the discrepancies in higher education teaching. So we've looked very much at certain philosophies, but we're going to see these philosophies are not necessarily shared around the world. So we have to be aware of these discrepancies when we welcome international students or when we ourselves as instructors travel overseas. We can explore some of the tension which has occurred as the push for global education has taken place in higher education, and then we will look at and reflect on the way global South countries are forging a new way forward in matters of pedagogy through a process of decolonizing the curriculum. Okay, so this will all become clear as we unfold. So it is important whenever we look at a topic in a course on a master's that we look at a global lens, because sometimes what happens nationally or domestically is not the same as what happens elsewhere. And this is the case in this course. We need to spend a little bit of time, even if we don't have time to necessarily explore all the readings, to look at what is the flavor of the topic that we've concentrated on for these 6 weeks. What does it look like when we take a more global sort of perspective? So why is it important? Because we've had a very sort of powerful push in education for what is called global education. So what is global education? So I've written on the slide, it's a process which we invest in order to create opportunities for students to develop an ability to address issues, and maybe I should have said students and instructors, to develop an ability to address issues and themes from two simultaneous perspectives, the local scale and the international perspective. And that's really, in a nutshell, the aim of global education, is to enable you to look both regionally at your very, very regional sort of scale and dimension, and to then examine the same problems on a much different scale. And this is all built on this notion of creating global citizens. So if you're interested in this, I don't know if you've got a global education course on your master's. There's one at UPI, but I'm not sure it's offered on your stream. But if you went into further detail, you'd explore then the notion of global citizen, which has been around since the 1945. And that's generally how we define being global citizens. It's being able to be at ease and comfortable looking at the same issues on very, very different scales, your very regional context and the very global context. And how do we achieve that? Well, we achieve that by allowing people to travel, to think outside the box, to be confronted with other cultures, and to be pushed out of the boundaries, if you like, without letting go of the boundaries, because the regional is still important, but to combine the regional perspective with the global perspective. And so you've got a reading on this, which discusses this notion of global citizenship. Where does it come from? So it's grounded in a long history of peace education, which started in 1945. The UN had great part to play in this, in sort of ascertaining that or asserting that there could not be peace without having some sort of global education that allowed people to think beyond borders. And then it goes further than that, and also is grounded on several of the UN principles for sustainable development. So if you look at the UN principles for sustainable development, there are 17, I think, from memory, and you'll see that this notion of global education sort of overlaps on several of them and is built on several of those. And it leads, how does it manifest itself? Well, it leads to greater international mobility, obviously, of students and instructors. And I think all of you have experienced this. All of you have have dealt with this on your own sort of personal context. So we've discussed this already at length in the course. Now, before we go further, I'm just going to move my camera there. Before we go further, we have to contrast this notion of global education with another very similar term, but that's very different, the term of globalization. And that is at play as well in higher education. So what is globalization? I've said here, I call it an extensions of the principles of neoliberalism, sort of turbo power version of neoliberalism. So it's going to be problematic because we already have expressed several reservations or concerns about neoliberalism in higher ed during the course through some of the media pieces, and then we're going to focus on that for the last unit. But we also already feel that tension. And here we're putting forward this notion of turbo-powered neoliberalism. So it's even more powerful than neoliberalism. So why is it a turbo-powered sort of version? Because it argues, so remember neoliberalism argues that the best possible outcome is always achieved when you let the markets be free. Now, globalization is going to be going even further and say not only should the markets be free, but they should not be constrained or restricted by national boundaries, by states or by national regulations. So globalization is this push that you're seeing currently for multinationals to be able to operate freely across borders and not be regulated by national laws or national border controls or national policies and regulations. So in essence, multinationals become more powerful than the countries themselves. So you can see how this is sort of the most extreme sort of version of neoliberalism, and one that worries a lot of people. And to be honest, one that is playing a lot of political havoc at the moment, because much of what we've seen in the sort of the sort of populist movement in England and in the US has played on this, on the fears of globalization. Fear that is understandable. People are worried about multinationals suddenly having more powers than even their countries themselves. So two very different perspectives here. We're going to talk about global education, but obviously in the back of your mind, you should keep in focus on the fact that sometimes the boundaries between global education and globalization is very hazy, and sometimes people are pushing for global education, and really what they're pushing for is globalization. The effects are very different, the objectives are very different, the impact is very different. But sometimes people are using word interchangeably when they shouldn't. They should actually be creating clarity. But if we focus on global education itself, so global education in its sort of well-intentioned forms has led to obviously extreme mobility among students. And some may argue that globalization also leads to extreme mobility among students. That's why it's so hard sometimes to differentiate the two. But global education in its well-intentioned form is about sharing cultures, leading people into sort of multicultural perspectives on things, being able to allow them to be looking both at domestic context and international context. And that's best achieved when people move. But this in turn leads to very specific issues, multicultural issues in the classroom. We've welcomed students, but often as teachers and high education instructors, we've not always thought about what teaching to students from different cultures means, and it's created clashes. So you've got two readings in the readings this week. Those talk specifically about the problems of group work and collaborative work. So we've looked at social constructivism, and here already we have an issue. And doing social constructivism work when people come from very different backgrounds can be very challenging. There are other issues, and maybe on Monday night during the collaborate session, prepare yourself with ideas and arguments and thoughts. We can open this conversation a little bit more and look at other specific issues that are challenging us as instructors when it comes to this notion of multicultural classroom, globally sort of opened classroom. What it leads to is the integration of what is now being called culturally responsive pedagogy. So you're going to see an emerging body of literature around culturally responsive pedagogy. Again, I'm not going to expand on this too much at the moment. We're just opening up the conversation. But we might be able to talk about this a little bit more on Monday night and see if some of you have had some experiences with culturally responsive pedagogy. And maybe you want to just look it up and see what some of what's falling within that body of literature, and see if we can discuss that on Monday. So those are the very practical, sort of immediate challenges that we have as higher education instructors with global education and mobility of students. But it's not just that. We've seen that active learning, constructivism, social constructivism, experiential learning, inclusion, critical pedagogies are philosophies that are very pertinent to us. But we have to contextualize that. They're very pertinent to us in a post-industrial lens of global North countries. So what do I mean by post-industrial lens? Well, most countries that are considered from the global North have gone through industrialization from the end of the 19th century into the sort of 2/3 of the 20th century, and have then moved on to an economy that is called post-industrial, which means that we're not so focused on making things and having factories and things like this, but we're very focused on services. And what do we call global North countries? So global North countries is a term that you're going to encounter a lot in global education and in economics as well. Is this notion that they are countries who share a GDP, so certain factors of growth. They've achieved a post-industrial sort of development. And why they call global North, they also tend to be countries that have been involved in colonization for the most part. And why they call global North countries? Well, because they are generally obviously called the North versus the South. So the ex-colonial North versus the South. So obviously US, Canada, France, and England, and most of the European countries of the original group of the European countries. Maybe there's more of a debate about the later comers, but not just those. Japan too is counted into global North, and Australia and New Zealand. So you see that right away. There's a disparity because they're not actually in it's sort of a North Hemisphere, but there's this geographical disparity. So it's a symbolic North rather than a geographical North. But they all share these sort of characteristics. For global South countries who are still in the middle of industrial development, dealing with vast and growing demographics, something that we don't deal with in the global North because we have got now a demographics that doesn't renew our population. Universal access to K-12 education as global South countries may not be yet a right, but just a privilege. In these contexts, didactic approach to teaching, teacher-centric practices, summative assessment may still make a lot of sense because you're dealing with vast numbers, you're trying to do a lot, very vast numbers, and you're doing it very quickly. Maybe in that sense, it's possible to see a lot of what we've discussed in this course as being what people call a first world problem, and something that is not as urgent and pressing in global South countries because they're still dealing with many of the variables that we've listed there. This means that sometimes students who are involved in mobility, international mobility, may have come from countries where, in their higher education context, they've been used to very didactic sort of methods, very teacher-centric approaches, often just summative assessment. And now they're moving into an environment where the reflection on pedagogy has developed in a very different way. This creates a clash. And ironically, that clash is not always well lived. So you might assume that students transition into these new systems and love it, but often they are sort of catapulted into these systems without introductions, without context, and it can be very difficult for them to understand why these systems and these philosophy of teaching are so different than what they've experienced back home. And often what we see is resistance, not adherence, not embracing those new approaches. It can be unsettling for instructors. I'm sure some of you have experienced this already. We can discuss this a little bit more on Monday and look at solutions and how to manage this. It is very much the same thing as we've discussed when we discussed transitional friction. So even when you have a class that is not used to maybe more innovative practices and you want to transition them into those practices, it's going to be a case of the same, but obviously to the power of 10, because you may be dealing with students who've just been accustomed to a lecture style, to finals, very little creativity in the teaching style, and suddenly you're introducing to learning practices that are extremely student-centered, extremely creative, extremely deconstructed. So you're going to have to assist. You're going to have to handhold as students are being transitioned into this, because otherwise, ironically, what you get is pushback. We don't get these international students loving what they're being introduced to. They're getting feeling quite daunted and quite scared, and they push back against that. So you've got quite a few readings on that as well. It's a concept to keep in mind because it does affect the way we experience teaching in multi cultural classes. Okay, let me just switch. Now, it's not just an issue for students. It can be an issue for instructors too. So more and more in global education, more and more instructors are having an opportunity to teach elsewhere. It's something in your career you might consider, or that might well be a possibility in the future. So you also have to think about how you would adapt if you were sent into a country where the context is still very didactic, is still very teacher centric, and how you would sort of hold on and try to achieve some of what you're achieving now and some of what we've taught in this course, but to do it in a context that is not used to that yet. So there's another cultural clash that can happen there, and there's quite a bit of literature on that. It's particularly relevant because within globalization this time, I wouldn't necessarily call it global education, though some may disagree, but I would say it's within globalization. So this notion of neoliberalism, what we're seeing a lot of our campuses try to play this role of sort of multinational expansion, and with a lot of competition within that. So a lot of universities have realized that their business model within the global north is becoming increasingly competitive. And through market analysis, they decided that the best way of surviving is actually to go and look for new markets. So instead of looking for domestic markets, instead of just waiting for an influx of international students, often they decided they need to go and compete elsewhere, and they need to go into the global south and compete there. So what we're seeing is the creation of these what we call satellite campuses. It's very, very, very popular at the moment. What it was just before COVID, it's going to be interesting what happens now. The Australian universities have been extremely proactive in this field. So you're going to see a lot of, sort of universities, Australian universities with campuses in the Far East. But it's not just Australian universities. Canadian universities have done the same. So you're probably aware that UPI has opened a campus opened a campus agreement for a presence in Cairo in Egypt. Most universities are have got a finger in the game, and they're playing this, and they're involved in this in different ways, in different sort of forms, which means that a lot of personnel, staff, instructors are often now getting the incentive of working overseas in this, again, culturally difficult climate, because you're exporting your teaching formats, your policies, your vision into your context that probably has its own, and that is going to clash with some of the teaching philosophies that you are trying to integrate there. So this said, it's a quickly changing landscape. So it would be wrong to fall into stereotypes and to think that because, for example, India, he's now fully into an industrial development, that it will just follow the pattern that, for example, England has followed, and that it will have the same successes and failures in a same linear way just because a colonial power has done so, a couple of 150 years ago. Um, we are in a quickly changing landscapes where now these connections are being done in very different ways through varying networks, which means that these countries that are going through industrial development now are not necessarily going to follow the pattern that we followed. So we shouldn't expect them to just go through a progression of ideas and a growth of philosophies, particularly around teaching, that mirrors the one that we've had. So there's already now pockets of student-centered progressive teaching occurring in pockets in global South countries, including constructivism, including even critical pedagogy. And these countries are therefore not necessarily following the linear process through this process of change. It's accelerated. It happens in ad hoc, sort of haphazard ways, but we're seeing sort of happening. So think about that development of new approaches and progressive pedagogy as something that is going to probably happen in sort of a very sort of sort of oil stain way, but not even as an oil stain, because it's going to be very sort of sporadic, more like fire, if you want, fire sparkles that are sort of spreading in a way that we can't necessarily expect or predict, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. So generally we have this opposition: global north very preoccupied on student teaching, student-centered teaching; global south still very preoccupied about efficiency and productivity and getting people through, so therefore very teacher-centric practices. But amongst that, fire sparks happening all around the world where really interesting things are going on. And in these cases, sometimes some of those countries saying, well, we want to do better than the global north. We don't want to make the mistakes they've done and take as long as they've done to get there, but we want to shortcut to where they are now, and we want to shortcut to where they are now in a way that avoids some of the mistakes. So I've been involved, for example, in India quite a bit, and I've been going to India quite a bit and involved in a network of practitioners. And Indian schools, for example, are very interested in inclusion, very interested in UDL. But when you go over and you participate in those workshops or those conferences, what they're saying is, first of all, how is what you're putting forward efficient for the demographics that we're talking about? So you're talking to me about UDL. Can you do UDL in classes of 50? Can you do DL in schools of 3,000? Because if you're only talking for small numbers, you're not interested. That's not what we're about. So, already forcing you to transpose these models into large scale reflection, sustainable large scale reflection, right? When you talk to people in India about UDL, they say, how can we make this, have this embedded through our schools, make it work? But the other thing that they're also saying is, what are some of the mistakes that you've made along the way? And how can we leapfrog this? And how can we do this better than you're doing it? So some really interesting conversations happening there. And for us, it means that we have opportunities for collaborations and cooperation sometimes with people, radically different environments that are going to draw on us and say, what are some of the mistakes that have been done in your education system, in your institutions, in your, communities of practice, and how can we do better without having to go through the mistakes to get to the successes? The other interesting thing which is changing in this changing landscape is that global South countries are also involved in a simultaneous process of decolonizing the curriculum. So you hear about decolonizing the curriculum quite a lot in Canada and in Australia too, and New Zealand, because countries that are what we call still subject to a phenomenon of internal colonialism, we've engaged in this process of saying, how can we decolonize the curriculum? What do we call internal colonization? These are countries where a colonizing power has settled, but has then the country has had independence, but the settlers have not left. So in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia. So those countries are different, obviously, than a nation that's been sort of colonized and then has gained independence, because it's still a sort of white Caucasian settler majority that sort of rules the country, and therefore that has orientated the education system. So in those countries where we have still phenomena of internal colonization, we are now involved in a process of decolonizing, and that means looking inward and saying, we have actually got indigenous people here, and how can we actually break away from a model that has been imported from colonial times, and how can we reinvent something original within these countries to integrate indigenous people? And that's the word that you're hearing now, and that's been part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and processes that are being put forward. But in a global perspective, decolonizing the curriculum has a different meaning. For a country like, you take random example like Zambia, like Algeria, like India, decolonizing the curriculum is about pushing beyond post-colonialism. So what we mean by post-colonialism, the countries that I've just mentioned, and most of the countries in the world that have been colonized, are subject to what's now called a process of post-colonialism. Post-colonialism involves, after independence, colonial countries retaining a certain level of impact and influence in these ex-colonies, no longer by direct rule, by process of economic connections that often is maintained through a process of cultural connection. Now, some people like to say it's more than cultural connection. It's a process that has gone beyond colonial presence, and that continues to be a sort of imposition by the colonial power. How does that happen? So it happens in different ways, mostly by maintaining in position an elite that has taken the place of the colonial power, that has been educated in the colonial country, that speaks the language of the colonial country, that in lots of ways embraces the values of the colonial countries, and that elite has taken the place of the colonial power. So obviously, indirectly, it maintains an opportunity for connection, very tight connections back to the colony. And that means that your economic trade, all of your agreements are going to be primarily directed back to the ex-colony, because your elite still sees this as very much home turf. Okay, so that's how post-colonialism operates in most of global South countries. In terms of education, for us, it's even more sort of tangible, because post-colonialism often has meant the maintaining of language of instruction from the colony, teaching resources from the colony, curriculum from the colony, so in K-12, K-12, but also in higher education, a formatting of the institution that is mirrors and mimics what has the structure in the ex-colony, and method of assignments and assessments and all of these things, status, definitions of areas of disciplines, all of these things are still things that mirror what was the case in the colony, and is still maintained in these new countries through process of post-colonialism. So a lot of global South countries are aware of this process and are trying to break away from them, particularly in the field of education. So they're involved in the process of decolonizing the curriculum, which is very different. It's not about looking at indigenous people, it's looking at what in their education system remains too tightly tied to the ex-colony, and finding a way to move their education systems to values, objectives, a language of instructions, resources that are more pertinent to their local context than what has been imported from the colonies. So this is, as you can see, something that's going to be important too, because there's a lot of work, for example, at the moment on decolonizing the curriculum in higher education. South Africa is one example where it's happening very so proactively, very loudly. There's a lot of literature emerging from that. And again, that's going to mean that they are going to be insistent that they don't want necessarily, through this process of post-colonialism, follow the mistakes that we've done and follow, sort of 100, 150 years, the same process of development. They are interested in shortcutting this and in getting to similar goals, but getting to them in an authentic way. And it's going to be interesting for us in higher education, teaching and learning, because we're starting to see emerge approaches, philosophies, practices in these countries that might be entirely different than what we have done in the global north. So they might be looking towards inclusion, towards constructivism, towards these general values and philosophies, but doing it in a way that's unique, that's theirs, and that's pertinent to global south, and has never been done in global north. So keep your eyes out, and that's something that's going to be that's interesting at looking at higher teaching and higher education within a global lens. Lots to digest, lots to unpack. So we will take Monday night's collaborate session to make this interactive and have discussions around all of these themes without necessarily adding more, because you've got lots on your plates already. And again, not necessarily expecting you to go into the readings, but just expecting you to manipulate those concepts and those thoughts and those ideas, get interested in them, and then maybe go back to the readings at a later stage when you have more time. So have a good Sunday, and I will see you tomorrow night on Monday night for last collaborate session, and then we'll have one Zoom final one on Thursday. Okay, bye.